Thanks to everyone for attending today. As Ethan said, I'll be talking to you about whether removing hybrid cattail can help restore nearshore lake habitat and species diversity in Minnesota. So I'm at the University of Minnesota Sea Grant. Working with me on this project is Dan Larkin in the Fisheries, Wildlife and Conservation Biology program at the U. And then we have two grad students working on this project, Brendan Nee and Mike Tuma. And I should also say that we have a really strong collaboration with the Minnesota DNR, as well as the Voyageurs National Park on this project. And of course, our project's funded through the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund through MACERC. So what I want to start with today is a review of what a healthy nearshore lake ecosystem looks like in Minnesota and in the Great Lakes region. So in this photo, you can see a variety of shoreline plants. You might notice a few cattail here and there. When you move into the water, you can see the emergent zone is dominated by these brown-topped plants, which are bulrush and a really important emergent species in Minnesota and in the Great Lakes region overall. And then as we move out into the open water, you see floating leaf plants, things like water lilies. And of course, there are submergent plants we can't see there as well. So what's important in these systems is this physical variety of plant type. So you see bulrush as the dominant emergent plant, you see water lilies, and of course, below the water from a fish's perspective, we see submerged plants with both floating leaves and submerged leaves. So you can see from these minnows swimming through this bulrush that bulrush makes a nice environment for these fish. It's not too dense, fish can still swim through it, but they have protection from other fish predators. Bulrush does not accumulate a lot of litter year to year, so it maintains a good space for fish to swim through. And then when you have submerged leaf plants, this provides protection from other fish predators, also from avian predators, and also this habitat provides important locations for bugs or macroinvertebrates for fish to live, for fish to feed on. So important to have this heterogeneity and variety of plants in the nearshore zone. As I'm sure you all know, nearshore zones of lakes are critically important spawning and nursery areas for fish. In fact, most fish species in a lake spend at least some time in these nearshore zones. You can see a couple of larval fish here. You can see a stickleback ready to spawn, and of course, juvenile northern pike like these vegetated areas. There are also small-bodied fishes that spend their entire lives in these nearshore zones, things like these variety of species of minnow. These small fishes are important food for larger game species that are actually important to humans and that humans tend to care about. Unless you're a fish person, then you care about all fishes. So these nearshore zones are really critical for fish communities and other biota that live in our lakes. So what's happened in recent decades is our nearshore zones have started to look a little bit more like this photo. This is actually from the eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but it's very reminiscent of what we see on Minnesota lakes as well. So this nearshore zone is dominated by hybrid cattail, and you can see a close-up there. Hybrid cattail has the effect of homogenizing these nearshore zones. So instead of those pictures I showed you just a minute ago with lots of different types of plant species, we see a sort of homogeneous zone of cattail. So I want to talk a little bit about where this cattail came from, because this is often a question for folks. So we do have a native cattail in Minnesota. It's the broadleaf cattail, Typha latifolia. We also have a non-native species, a narrowleaf cattail, or Typha angustifolia. This likely came from Europe, probably in the 1800s, and I'll talk about that in a second. People always want to know how to tell these apart. So the way you can tell these apart, their name suggests one way, which is one has a broad leaf and one has a narrow leaf, but that's very difficult unless you're looking at these leaves right next to each other, which you often are not. You can also look at the male and female flowering parts of the plant. So this yellow part on top is the male part, the sort of catkin or the brown part is the female part. And in a broadleaf cattail, our native, there's little to no space between these two parts of the plant. So that's pretty distinct. When we look at the narrowleaf cattail, you can see there's a bigger space between the male and the female part of the plant, but this can be confusing, and I'll explain that in a second. So in addition, when you have these two species in the same range, so whenever narrowleaf cattail is found where broadleaf cattail is found, they hybridize. And this hybrid is the species that's the problem for nearshore zones in the Great Lakes and actually throughout the United States. So you end up with a hybrid cattail. It's called Typha x glauca. And when I talk about cattail for the rest of this talk, I'll be talking about the hybrid specifically. In terms of identification, you can see that there's some space between the male and the female part of the plant. This tends to be variable because these species backcross with each other. Sometimes you'll have space, sometimes you'll have no space. So it makes identification pretty tricky. Hybrid cattail does tend to grow in a very large clone. So that's another clue that you might have hybrid cattail in your area. So where did it come from? As I said, Europe. This is a map from a paper by Sugalatowicz et al. In 1999, which shows you the range of the hybrid Typha X glauca. So you can see the solid line here on the eastern seaboard in about 1860. That's when it first showed up. The red star is Minnesota. So you can see by the the late 1940s, definitely the early 50s, it had already spread to Minnesota and a little bit beyond. It's continued to spread all throughout Minnesota by the 70s, and it's continuing to spread across North America. So it's been here a long time. So sometimes in people's memory, hybrid cattail has always been around. So it's often hard to recognize as an invasive species, and that can make things complicated. I've got two photos to show you as an example of what happens with hybrid cattail. So this is an old aerial photo of Jackfish Bay in Rainy Lake in northern Minnesota. So you can see islands, and there's a bunch of roads that connect these islands. And you can see the black is, of course, lake and a lot of space. You know, just as this would be water flowing between these islands. So we're going to look at the same photo now in 2020. And what you see is this brown stuff is all hybrid cattail. So because they sort of changed the current, this cattail was able to fill in, and now they have a terrible problem with hybrid cattail. They're actually working on strategies to remove it. So this has just happened in the last, few decades or so. So it's an issue. So a quick primer about cattail reproduction and why this hybrid is a problem. So cattail reproduces by wind dispersed seeds. You've probably all seen this happen. It also reproduces by rhizome. That's this root that's buried underneath the sediment. A lot of wetland plants reproduce this way. And this is clonal. So this rhizome will sort of shoot out another root section and another stem will pop up. So that's very common in wetland plants. So why is it that this hybrid takes over so much? Why does our native cattail not do this? And the general explanation is hybrid vigor or heterosis. So the idea that the offspring of two parents does better in an environment than either of those parent species. It's common in corn and other plants. So for example, you have two parents here and the hybrid is bigger and perhaps better. That seems to be the case with hybrid cattail. So what happens is it has a faster growth rate than either of its parents. It's much taller. You can see here in the foreground native vegetation, and this green is hybrid cattail, growing much taller than other things in its environment. It produces larger clones, so they just grow out further. It produces a lot more biomass, so a lot of just live and dead standing leaf litter compared to the top picture, which is more of a native plant zone. It's tolerant of a wide range of water levels. We manage water systems. That's great for hybrid cattail. It prefers nutrient-rich systems, and we know that we've done that in a lot of lakes. It's also fairly tolerant of saline conditions. So when we put salt on our roads, we're probably not hurting hybrid cattail too much. So you can see that it's got the potential to be a problem in our region. One thing that is sort of less well known is we know a lot about this plant. But what is its effects in the ecosystem? We know quite a bit about how it affects plants. We know less about how it affects other biota, things like fish. And that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about today. So to give you some of the background of this work, I'm going to talk about some research we did in northern Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. And what we looked at there was how is the environment different in a cattail invaded section of a nearshore zone. So the picture here is on my right, cattail invaded, and then in a non-invaded zone. And just a quick summary of what we found. In cattail invaded regions of nearshore zones, you see less dissolved oxygen, less plant diversity, less fish abundance, lower fish abundance, and lower fish diversity. So I'm not going to show you those data, but that's what we see. And so what we can say is that cattail invasion really does affect not only the environment, but also biodiversity in the system. So the question is, this big orange question, how can hybrid cattail management help mitigate these negative effects? So we know these negative effects are happening. Does management help, and how can we help this problem? So what are our management options? As you probably know, we often spray hybrid cattail with herbicide. We burn it, we mow it, and sometimes we cut it below the water. So we know that herbicide and burning are pretty tough on things like larval amphibians and adult amphibians in particular, and also larval fishes. Um, and there has been some data that has suggested this method, cutting cattail below the water, can actually have some pretty effective restoration methods. So this is an example of some folks doing this work in the Great Lakes region. And essentially they've cut a channel through this cattail and making sure that they're cutting this cattail below the water. And when you do this, sometimes within the same season or in a season or two, you get some native plant regrowth. Native plant seeds, in aquatic systems can stay dormant in the sediment for a really long time. So if you open up the space, you provide light, those native plants will often grow back. It's very important that we cut cattail below the water. So cattail and many other wetland plants have these holes in their stems called parenchyma, and that allows the cattail to move oxygen from the top of the plant to the root. So when you're cutting that stem below the water, you're essentially drowning that stem. Now, if it becomes unsubmerged or gets access to the air, it will shoot up another stem still. So it needs to stay submerged for this method to work. Interestingly, when you look across, you kind of fly in a plane across Minnesota, you can see that we do this all the time, right? We cut channels through not only cattail, but other plants to try and get access for our boats, to get a better view of the lake, and try to get access to the open water. So we started wondering, does this sort of smaller scale mechanical harvesting that landowners are already doing, can that positively affect nearshore plant communities and nearshore fish communities? So that's sort of the idea for our project. In Minnesota, you can get an aquatic plant management permit to remove 15 feet of vegetation from shoreline to open water. And you can see this is a photo from a lake in Minnesota that the DNR shared with us. And you can see that even though they've cut, this is cattail, this tall plant here, their boat is presumably going in and out, we're seeing native plants grow back. So our idea here is try to determine, does cattail removal at this smaller scale increase plant diversity, and can it benefit water quality and fish communities in nearshore lake ecosystems? And we're also curious how this varies across the state. Maybe it works well in northern Minnesota, maybe it works less well in southern Minnesota. So this is the nuts and bolts of our question, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to try to address these questions. So to answer these questions, we've chosen 9 lakes. You can see northernmost is Rainy and the southernmost are Big Marine and Coon. And at each of these 9 lakes, we're establishing 2 sites. And this is kind of an aerial photo of our site in Big Marine. So we have 2 sort of rectangular sites, one at which we'll remove cattail and one at which we'll retain cattail. So that's our control site. So overhead view looks like this. These sites aren't always going to be so close next to each other. We're trying to find similar sites as similar as possible to one another in terms of cattail growth and sediment. And then we will remove cattail at one of these 2 sites. So just to give you a better picture of our timeline here, summer 2021, this was not this past summer, the summer before. So summer 2021, we established our sites. You can see in this little sort of hypothetical lake here, we have cattail retained and cattail removed sites. So before we removed any cattail, we went to both of these sites. We measured water quality, plants, and fish before we removed. In fall 2021, so this happened from October to December in 2021, we removed cattails at one of these 2 sites, at our removal site. And then in summer 2022, we went back and measured water quality, plants, and fish post cattail removal. So that's how our project proceeded. So you can see we kind of did a before and after, and our treatment was removing cattail. So quickly through what stuff we were measuring at each of these sites, just so you know what we're talking about here. We looked at water quality, dissolved oxygen, temperature, conductivity, and pH, pretty standard. We were measuring plant community, so things like species richness, number of species, abundance, to get an idea of how that may or may not change. And also fish community, again, species richness, diversity, and abundance. So pretty straightforward in terms of variables. I'm going to pause here and just give a shout out to our 2 MACERC fellow graduate students who are working on this project. They have spent 2 intense summers in the field. We only finished our last field season in the very beginning of September. So this is Brendan Nee working on the fish component of the project, and behind the cattail you see Mike Tuma, who works on the plant component of the project, and they are busily crunching data from this past summer. We've had 2 great technicians, Kaylin Schmidt from UMD and another student, Dylan Don from UMD this summer. It's kind of ironic that they're doing the same thing in the photo. I think that's what they spent a lot of their summer doing. So this project wouldn't work without these folks who are really expert on these topics at this point. So I wanted to show you, will show you a little bit of data, but since we just finished our field season in early September, I don't have a ton to show you, but I did want to show you sort of our hypothesis or what we think might happen here. And I won't be able to confirm this year. You'll have to come to next year's showcase to find out the final results. But this is what we expect. So if we look at a graph of average fish abundance on the y-axis and look at our cattail retained versus our cattail removed sites, and remember, this is what our sort of experimental design looks like. What we expect to see in terms of our cattail retained site is that the fish, in this case, fish abundance is pretty much similar, is quite similar between 2021 and 2022. Because at this site, we're not removing cattail. These little white stripes are just supposed to be simulated error bars. But we do expect to see some differences in the cattail removed site. So remember, cattail removal is occurring here. We expect to see an increase in fish abundance with cattail removal. So this is sort of our hypothesis. We can say the same thing about dissolved oxygen. We don't think that'll change very much. We think once we remove cattail, we'll see increased dissolved oxygen at this site. Similarly with plant diversity. So you can kind of see our expectation here. And again, I don't have all the data to show you, but I can show you a little bit of what we found. So in terms of plants, what we do see after removal is that native plants do start to grow back, right? Clearly in all of our lakes, there are a seed bank in the sediment, and these native plants regrow. It's likely to take more than a year for them to, of course, regrow fully. But we also did a pretty good job with our retreatments in removing cattail stems. So this is just a plot showing you cattail abundance in one of our control and treatment plots. So you can see in our control plot where we didn't remove cattail, we have 50% cattail cover, and in our treatment plot, it's much, much lower. So this is what we hope to see, right? Our treatment was effective in removing cattail. And then this photo is of a quadrat, one of Mike's quadrats, where he's collecting percent cover, plant abundance, and diversity data. And you can see this is a removal site, and you can see lots of native plants growing back here, water shield, some potamogetans. He's seeing a lot of myriophyllum and also bladderworts come back in these places where cattail has been removed. So we are seeing native plant regrowth. So that's a good thing to note so far. In terms of fish data, I don't have summaries of the fish data from this current year, but I do have some of our pre-removal data. And I thought I'd show you that just to show you what kinds of fish we find in dense cattail stands. So remember, this is all fish within these dense cattails. So I'm going to show you the same graphs here, one after the other. So you can see here, this is total fish abundance. This is just across all 9 lakes, just to show you what we found overall. So notice that this goes from 0 to 6,000 fish, right? Most of the fish we catch in cattail stands are sunfishes. So that's like small pumpkin seeds, bluegills, largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, rock bass. By and large, that's what live in cattail stands. We also see quite a few bullheads, again, just under 1,000. The important thing to note about bullheads is that the males take care of their young. So the males swim around with a school of young. So when those juveniles go into a minnow trap, if you get one, you often get 100. So we do tend to see a lot of bullheads in our traps, and they tend to be little ones. We see quite a few yellow perch, particularly in Lake Cabotogama. We see quite a few mud minnow, and if you're not familiar with mud minnow, these are not a true minnow, but they're a species of fish that's very tolerant of low oxygen. So we see quite a few of those in a cattail stand. And you see I have some other fish here with no bars. That's because I need to change the scale of the y-axis. So this is the same graph, but I've changed the scale of the y-axis from 0 to 300 fish. You can see you've already seen the almost 6,000 sunfish, the bullheads, the perch, and the mud minnow. We also see some banded killifish, again, maybe a species you're not super familiar with, but pretty small, lives at the surface. We don't see a lot of minnows, under 50 minnows across all of our 9 lakes, and I'll maybe explain a little bit why we think this is in a few minutes. We see some baby bowfin or dogfish and a few northern pike as well. They tend to like these wetland areas. So you can get an idea of our fish community, and it'll be really interesting to see how that community changes or doesn't change, right, when we remove the cattail. One overall summary I wanted to show you is how some of these variables change across this gradient. So this is an aerial photo. Again, you can see our researchers right here. This is the shoreline. This is open water. This is, again, big marine. And again, a representation of our control plot and our cattail removal plot. So we're taking measurements of dissolved oxygen across this transect. So one in the shore, one sort of, at the shoreline, underwater, of course, in mid transect, and then near the open water or at the outer edge. So what we see is dissolved oxygen increases from shore to open water, and we do see a corresponding difference in fish community. So our fish community near the shore, where the cattail is the densest, tends to be these mud minnows and sunfishes. The only time you see minnows, true minnows, is near the outer edge, where the cattail tends to be a little bit more sparse. This is particularly important because if you study game species, people who look at diets of things like walleye, they don't find them filled with sunfish and mud minnow. What they find them filled with is our minnow species. So minnow species really are the base of the forage community for these large predators. If we are displacing minnows by sort of filling in this habitat with cattail, that could be a problem. Minnows school, so their anti-predator strategy is to school together, right? A sunfish's anti-predator strategy is to hide in vegetation. So minnows tend to be more at that interface between vegetation and open water, and probably more readily available to predators like walleye. So this will be interesting to see if we see an increase in minnows in our removal sites, but time will tell. Just a quick summary of impacts before I get to your questions. So what our goals are to understand how cattail removal affects fish communities regionally, right? North to south. We want to determine if cattail removal at this scale is an effective management strategy. And one thing I didn't mention that I should have mentioned is that the width of our cattail removals is 30 feet, or about 10 meters. We chose that width because it doubles the current width of what you can get with an aquatic plant management permit. So it's about twice the size of the management permit. We were just curious to see if that would have an effect. We hope to directly inform Minnesota DNR to help make landowner permitting decisions. They've been really supportive of this project. They've helped us find sites for this project, and I think are really interested in hearing the results. We have a big public outreach component. That's, of course, what Sea Grant is really interested in, as MACERC as well. We really want to stress the importance of native plant communities to fishes. So I talk a lot about cattail removal, but it's not really cattail removal, it's native plant restoration, right? We're trying to grow this native plant community back, not just remove the cattail. So to that end, in collaboration with Kristen Lobeek, who was formerly at MACERC, we developed this little informational postcard that our field team hands out on the boat dock. I hand it out to lake association meetings I present at, to try and give an idea of what we're trying to do, the restoration component, and why it's important to have native plants in your nearshore lake zone. And of course, they can always contact us for further information. I would be handing these out to you if I was in person, so just pretend you're receiving one. I can always hand them out digitally if you're interested. So what are future research questions? First, I think it'll be really important to monitor cattail regrowth over the long term. For example, what maintenance is required to sustain these openings? How long do you have to go between maintaining these openings? We did rectangles, but maybe circles are better, or maybe a U-shaped channel is better. So there's lots of other configurations you could think of. Use of muskrats to maintain openings. I know Voyagers has found, and we have found in our work in the Great Lakes region, that when you open up cattail, hybrid cattail stands, muskrats almost always come in and will build a little hut. They don't care that it's hybrid. They don't seem to be as good at finding a path through this really dense stuff until we open it up. So I think that would be really interesting. One thing that's not on this slide that we've thought about investigating as well is the effect of hybrid cattail removal on wild rice. I know in Voyagers, they're doing a lot of cattail removal, and they see a lot of wild rice restoration. So I think that's a really important component in Minnesota as well. With that, I am done talking at you, and I would be happy to answer any questions and want to thank Voyagers and Minnesota DNR and also MACERC for support for this project. So thanks.
Thanks, Amy. And I can read out the questions if you like. So the first
Okay.
question we have is, so is the hybrid cattail listed in the Minnesota invasive species list? And if not, why?
So this is a good question. The DNR does consider it invasive, and I will tell you that I am not a DNR employee, so I will not probably get this exactly right, but um, it's not a restricted invasive species. So what that means when it's a restricted invasive species, you can't move it around, you can't really carry it, you can't do anything with it. Hybrid cattail is not listed at that as that at this point. I think one of the challenges is it's so ubiquitous. As I described earlier, it's been here for a really long time, so people don't always recognize it as an invasive species. We are never going to eradicate it. There's just no possible way. So we have to look at management options. It's also quite difficult sometimes to tell it apart if you're not used to looking for it, to try and tell it apart from our native species. So I think there's a lot up in the air about hybrid cattail in the state, and we're hoping that our study will provide more information on that.
Thanks. Next question. Do you know how long it typically takes for the hybrid cattail to grow back into the cut area if there's no further management?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, and actually I'm going to flip backwards to this picture. So if you see this picture here, this is probably one summer. This is probably 1 year after this original cut was made. And what you see is the cattail, you can see stems growing in from the side. So what happens is as long as those stems don't emerge from the water, the ones you cut, cattail, those rhizomes will eventually grow in from the side. They'll shoot up another stem. So this is after 1 year. I think anecdotally, people have said it might take 5 years for the whole thing to fill in. But because it's pretty slow, if you were doing some of these openings, you would definitely have to have maintenance, but maybe something a little bit easier would be to sort of every spring or probably more likely every fall, you run around the edge with one of those little underwater weed cutters, and that would take care of it rather than letting the whole thing fill in and then recutting it. So it does grow back, and it's a management strategy that's going to always take attention.
And this is a pretty good follow-up to that. Did you use the mechanical harvester or the weed whacker style of removal? I imagine the harvester would remove more of the roots and rhizomes.
Yeah, so our removals were variable. We had 9 lakes that were all super different. So we contracted that out, and they did in some places use a cutting bar on a boat, and in some places they did a lot of hand removal. Um, Whatever removal type we did not want to stir up or remove rhizomes from the sediment. So our goal was really to cut it as close to the sediment as we can, because that's what you're allowed with the permit, right? You're really not allowed to dredge or dig out any of those roots. So we were very careful to only cut below the water because it's complicated. It often ends up that hand removal can be more precise. And of course, because we're doing a study, we wanted them to be relatively the same width. There was always some hand cutting that was required, but some places used a cutting bar on a boat as well.
Thanks. And the next question we have, is this the first time this type of management has been used, or has cutting below the water's surface been used in other states, if you know?
Yeah, so we have some research going on with the same thing in the Great Lakes, and there's a group out of Loyola Chicago who've done a lot of work on this type of removal. They've compared cutting below the water to things like crushing and harvesting, above the water. And it looks like this below the water it just works the best. When you harvest and you don't submerge stems, the cattail can come back really fairly quickly. I mean, I don't have a picture right up here, I don't think, but even some of our removal sites that we removed below the water drops and those cut stems emerge from the water and they will shoot up another stem. So when you harvest, you just cut, but you don't submerge those cut stems. that's going to grow right back the next year. So it's cutting below the water that gives you a longer lasting effect. And people are using this, at least in Michigan that I know of. And there have been some work cutting channels through cattail in New York, especially for restoration of. So sometimes you have an interior part of the marsh that's still open, but you have cattail that's grown in and disconnected that open marsh from the open water. And they have some pike restoration that they're doing by creating channels through the marsh to try and allow fish species access to an interior marsh that doesn't have cattail for spawning. So people are using this, yes.
Does the rhizome die after water gets into, and I'm not going to be able to say this word correctly, parenchyma?
Arinkema,
Parenchyma.
yeah, arinkema.
Thank
Good.
you, Amy.
Yeah, yeah. No, the rhizome does not die, and that's a really good question. So you're like not killing the whole plant, right? It's this big clone. You're drowning that stem. But if you look in this picture, this stem here is grown back because the rhizome has just shot out another little edge, right? So it's not really killing the whole plant. You're killing that one stem, but that rhizome then can scooch in from the side and shoot up another stem, if that makes sense. If I didn't answer that well, you can ask it a different way.
And then can you talk about how decreasing some hybrid cattail bog can affect methane release? What is the deepest, and then also what is the deepest water you've seen hybrid cattail grow?
Ooh, that's a good question. Okay, so methane is interesting. So cattail, can you read me the methane question again? I
Yeah,
suppose I could
absolutely.
look at it on my.
Can you talk about how decreasing some hybrid cattail bogs can affect methane release?
Yep, and this is not my area of expertise. We did do some of the work we did in the Great Lakes region talks about this, because what happens is you get a lot of decay underneath, and so these typha bogs kind of burp out. They burp out this methane, but pseudocut stems. So when you're doing this removal, you are perhaps increasing that methane release a little bit because it's coming out from where you've cut those stems, and those bogs hold on to a lot of decay, and you do get methane from that as well. People have also studied, and I could probably, if anyone's really interested in those papers, you can send me an email and I can send you some references. But even crushing, yes, you're removing cattail, but you are causing increased methane release. I should also say that bogs, we did not deal with bogs. We probably need to deal with bogs in the future. Those floating mats are very complicated. They really they cause a lot of problems for lakes and navigation and landowners and people who want to use the lake, in addition to methane release. So those are an issue. There was a second part, Ethan. I forgot it
Yep,
already.
just what's the deepest you've seen hybrid cattails grow?
That's a good
Deepest.
question. Definitely in a meter, more than a meter of water. They don't grow as deep as bulrush in my observation, but I am by no means the expert in how deep a cattail could grow. I would guess that probably other people have other anecdotal evidence of it growing even more deeply, but it does grow much deeper than the native species. But you'll often see bulrush out beyond a cattail stand. So easily in a meter of water.
Okay, our next question. Are the plant and fish species richness studied only in the direct corridor where the cattail was removed or in the surrounding area?
In our study, only in the direct corridor. So, there's a lot of folks who do work in cattails or near cattail stands and collect fish outside that stand. Um, and we were really interested in collecting the fish that were actually using the cattail and then the cattail area that we removed. I think in future studies, it would be important for us to look both within and surrounding those cattail stands. One of the real challenges with studying fish communities and cattail stands is it's really hard to get your gear in there. So we use minnow traps. You saw that picture. I won't spend too much time going here. Let's see. A picture of Brendan holding that minnow trap there. And you can see, sorry, I'm sure this is annoying. You can see the size of it there. So we're catching small fish. People also use larger fyke nets or trap nets. They're very cumbersome in really, really dense cattail. So it's very difficult to sample there. And I think one of Brendan's sub projects on this, on his work, is looking at some different types of methodology and how it compares sampling within these dense stands. Because we really wanted a sense of, if you're restoring this, right, if you're removing cattail and you have this restoration plot, what is that actually doing in that location?
All right, on the next question. Would you try to control cattails in very shallow and or maybe out of water areas as well?
If you can, yes. I mean, they grow, they grow in these large clones, so they expand. So one interesting thing, and if you're interested, Voyagers has a they've been working on cattail for a long time. They've just put together a couple of videos about their project. One of the things, and they have, they're a park, so they can do all kinds of interesting things. And one of the things they do is do this really intensive harvesting. Um, and one of the issues with harvesting cattail in a large area is you have tons of biomass, right? And so you have all this biomass, you don't want to just pile it on shore because it's going to leach all kinds of nutrients back into your lake, and that's also not good. So you need to put it away from the watershed. But what they're trying is piling that dead biomass that they've harvested from the water on shore and smashing down their sort of shoreline hybrid cattail with that. And they're reseeding that with a native plant mix in hopes that those nutrients from that cattail biomass can help regrow native plants. So they're kind of getting it out of the water and also trying to get rid of it on shore, to try and get a better handle on containing it. It's going to grow back. So getting as good of a handle on the source population as you can, I think would work the best.
This next question, most of your photos showed submergent plant regrowth. Have you seen regrowth of emergent vegetation, such as bulrush?
Um, let's see. I cannot tell you exactly bulrush. I know we see Sagittaria, arrowhead. We've seen some arrowhead regrowth. So we are seeing some emergence, especially in the shallow zone. I don't think we're seeing bulrush growing yet in the deep water zone. And Mike will tell you that that's probably because it'll take a little bit longer to establish. One piece I didn't talk about here that Mike is working on is a seed bank study. So they've taken some soil cores from these removal areas. They're growing them in the Macer containment lab to see what seeds are there. And I know that while they're seeing, of course, typha is growing as well, cattail is growing as well, they're also seeing some different native bulrushes regrowing in their experiments. So using that soil core that comes from the field. So the seeds are there. So I think given enough time, bulrush will reestablish in those sites.
There are several remaining questions that I would just love to consolidate into a couple.
Okay.
So people are people are asking sort of how long does the cattail removal last? And then also, is there a preferred season or time frame for effective cattail removal?
Yeah, good question. So in terms of how long, we still want to study that. I would say that the sort of target amount of time for that whole thing to fill back in is probably like 5 years. You'll get still a good opening in a couple of years, and I think you could extend that. Really, if you do a little bit of maintenance every year, you could pretty easily maintain that opening. Best to cut the cattail in the fall or the winter or early winter, sort of once all its energy has gone towards its growth. So we cut it as close to winter as we can. We were a little close last year with our last site getting cut in December. The real challenge in Minnesota lakes is water level management, right? So even for us, we had, some sites we cut, stems were submerged, water level drops, either from, either humans do that or drought does that, which is also humans, right? And then those stems regrow. So water level management is a real challenge for cattail removal. But I would say cutting it as late as you can in the fall is a good way to do it. I think another interesting thing would be to experiment cutting it over the ice. The person we contract with who who did our cattail cutting, does this all over the state, and was very interested to see how it would work to. It's pretty easy to cut it over the ice. It's hard to get your boat in there always to cut it. It's an endeavor, but if you could cut it over the ice and that maybe water comes up a little bit in the spring and those stems are submerged, that's also potential as well. So short answer, 5 years and late fall, early winter.
Thanks, Amy. And if nobody has any other questions, this will be our last question. When you mention using muskrats, do you mean natural colonization and not
Yeah, no,
introduction?
I won't move Russa. No, I don't think we should move muskrats around. That's not a good idea, but it's a good question because I kind of mentioned it off the cuff. And I think what would be most interesting is just sort of see what the population looks like. There's not a lot, people are interested in muskrats. Muskrats are actually quite culturally important, but there are not a lot of data about their populations. So it would be interesting, I think, to look at use of muskrats in these openings. So there is some work, and I'm not sure, I don't think it's been published yet, but I actually haven't checked in a while, in the Great Lakes, because we found this, they were experimenting also with circular openings and then openings near muskrat huts, and seeing. I think it would be very interesting to look at use, right? When you open this, do you see muskrats using it? What's the muskrat population? It would be a longer term tracking. We've even thought about throwing some GoPros out there in our openings to see what is using these openings versus what's using the dense cattail stands. There's been some work with birds as well. I think you could look at that as well. But I think muskrats would be interesting. And no, I don't advocate moving muskrats around. I think just studying their use of human created cattail openings would be pretty interesting.